I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for showing up. So what I'd like to talk about today is one of my favorite things in the whole world, which is designing command line tools that people don't just grudgingly use, but that they love to use. So let's dive in. What normally happens is that someone realizes, we need to make a command line tool. And people go, okay, well, we want to use Go, right? Obviously, it cross-compiles, that's great. But then they go, okay, let's just throw some commands together, and eventually they realize that they may have dug themselves into a hole. And the reason is because it wasn't designed up front. And you kind of make some decisions that will haunt you for the rest of your life. Ooh. Okay, we want to avoid that. So what can we do? A few things that we'd like to do to avoid the evil hauntings is we'd like to make commands and a tool that is predictable, that is guessable, that makes your help text unnecessary completely. We'd like to make commands that are task-oriented. Now, what does that mean? It means that it helps me perform day-to-day things that helps me get my job done. It doesn't just do, for example, list all the foo bars, okay? I want something that'll do my dishes for me. I want something that'll post silly messages to Slack for me. I want something that will chain together multiple commands and get stuff done. Another thing that would be really great for a command line tool to do is to have a little bit of empathy for the fact that I suck at typing, especially if someone's watching me do it live on stage, which I'm not going to do today because I really do suck at typing live on stage. All right? But I would like a tool to be able to be friendly both when I'm sitting there typing at the terminal and also when I'm scripting something maybe for a CI pipeline or just all those little dot files that I have hidden away somewhere. And then last, but I really hope not least, because this is brutally important to me because it's my job, is that it needs to be high quality. It can't just be this thing that we tack on at the end and we go, oh yeah, we need a CLI, and we make it and we shove it out of the way, and then we make the junior devs and the new person work on it. It actually needs to be high quality. It needs to be respected. It needs to be important code. Otherwise, I don't have a job. So, why am I the person up here telling you why this is important? I've worked on a couple different command line tools. Some of you may know about them. The Docker Version Manager, DVM, is one of them. Now it's maybe not that useful, but back in the day, it really mattered which version of Docker you had on your machine, and so it helped make you switch between Docker 1.13 and 1.11 and stuff like that. You may have heard of DEP. Sorry, I worked on that. Kubernetes Service Catalog. This totally doesn't matter what these tools are. I just wanted to get a feel for some of the horrific crimes that I've committed in the name of good user interface. I've made mistakes, and I've learned from them, and this is the talk. And another one, this actually is the reason why we have this talk, is Porter. So when I said I've made mistakes, Porter was a brand new tool that I wrote a little bit at the end of last year, beginning of this year, in a brand new space, Greenfield, which was super fun. And I got to take all my mistakes and all my what-ifs and go, what if I made a high-quality command line tool that was written at the same level of quality as all the back-end code that I was usually paid to write? And I put a lot of work into it. I put my soul into it, my heart into it, and had a ton of fun with it, essentially. And all the things I learned writing Porter, which you don't need to know anything about, but that's what this talk is based on. So before you write a single line of code, we want to think about what it's going to feel like when you interact with and use your command line tool. And I like to start with the grammar, because when you work with your command line tool, it's almost like a language. It's almost like you're interacting with it. I mean, half the time when you're working with it, you're telling your friend next to you, say you're pairing or something, or you're telling Bob how to fix something. You're going, you should run, kubectl git pods or something. And sometimes you feel like a dork because you're saying it out loud and it sounds weird. And sometimes it sounds like a normal English language. Why is that? Because it's a grammar. It's got a subject, it's got a noun, it's got verbs. And so when you're designing your command line tool, let's give a nod to that. Let's acknowledge that it is a grammar and work with that. So there's a couple different rules that maybe you want to follow. So I speak English, so I'm probably going to put my verb first, and then my nouns, okay? Other things you may want to decide ahead of time so that you're not horribly stuck with decisions made and you can't change them later because people hate change, would be, do I want to do long flags that have hyphens in them, or do I want to use camel case? Do I want to have like heavily nested subcommands that go on forever that read like sentences, or do I want to hyphenate them and do things more like, Git plugins, things like that? These are decisions you want to make now because people aren't watching. You can make any decision you want. You can be king of your castle, and most people are going to ignore you. And then later on, when it's more popular and there's a lot more commands set in stone, they're going to point at your decisions and go, ha-ha, you can't change your mind now. There's already 6 commands written. So that's what I mean by it comes back and haunts you. So you get to pick your own grammar. You get to start from scratch. But actually, I lied, you really don't. Usually there's precedent in your ecosystem. And what I mean by ecosystem is this. Service catalog, for example, is part of the Kubernetes ecosystem. And Kubernetes has the Kubernetes CLI, and everyone argues about how to pronounce it. kubectl, 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 whatever. But it has a certain pattern of how you work with it. It uses the verb get, for example. It uses describe instead of inspect or show. These are things that when I wrote the service catalog CLI, if I had decided to use different verbs, I kind of would have been a jerk to my users because their fingers remembered exactly how to work with kubectl. And half the time, they were running a command in kubectl and then jumping back and forth to service catalog CLI. And if I had decided to use different things, it would have constantly been a weird mismatch of expectations. And by using the same patterns and following the precedent set in this ecosystem, instead of tripping up my users and going, whatever, I know better, I don't like how this CLI works, I could build on top of what they've learned, and they could come into my CLI knowing half of how it works already, and all of a sudden I've set them up for success. Same thing for the Docker version manager. If someone likes version managers, which maybe you do, maybe you don't, if you already know one of them, being able to jump in and use another and have it work exactly the same is totally a benefit. Sometimes though, you don't want to follow precedent at all. So Glide worked a certain way, and a whole bunch of people knew how to use it, and dep came along, and we fought long and hard and said, do we want to have an install command? Do we want to have an update command? And we decided no, and the reason why is because it wasn't going to work the same way. The behavior was going to be completely different, and we were going to set people up for a huge expectation mismatch if our commands lied to people, essentially. So we went with a different verb. We went with ensure, basically to call out to people, hold up, wait, this is not going to work the way you're used to. Porter had a really neat kind of greenfield in front of it. It's part of the Cloud Native Application Bundle spec, and it's brand new, and like 2 people have heard about it. You don't need to know anything about it, but what's cool about it is that it is a brand new ecosystem. There was no tools out there, and I got to pick my own precedent, which means more work for me, because I had to come up with something that would work for Porter, but also it meant that any tools that followed me probably were going to be ripping me off, and maybe I need to make decisions that we're going to have to stand the test of time, not only for Porter, but other tools that followed. So a little bit of responsibility there. So lots of theory, but that's no fun. Let's make a CLI. So before emojis were a thing, I remember Emoticon. And they're super cute and super expressive, but a huge pain in the butt to type, and I'm always like Googling how to use them. So I would like a command line tool that helps me very quickly paste emoji into Slack, or emoticons into Slack. And one of the first rules that I like to follow when I'm making a command line tool is I like to have sentences that are easy to say. In fact, every single command, when I start thinking, what should it look like? The very first thing I do before I even type it out is I just say it. And it better be easy to say, otherwise, okay. So this is like the softball right here. So emote, add emoticon, gopher. I speak English, native speaker, that sounds pretty cool to me. Same thing, emote, delete, emoticon, anxious. Sounds pretty cool, we don't need to talk, right? We can all just go home? No, okay. But let's go on to some harder rules that I like to say. Positional arguments. So you have your command, right? And then you have a verb, and then maybe a noun, all right? But then positional arguments is what come after. It's not the flags, but it's the thing that's just unadorned that comes after. And this is where sometimes you get tripped up, and you're like, I'd like to be able to do something where maybe I need to have multiple things after it. Should I use flags, or should I just have a whole bunch of arguments after? So let's take a look at this. I'd like to be able to have a file with a whole bunch of different emoticons in it. And I could have like table flipping and like monocle man and fun stuff. So should it be the name of it and then the URL? Should it be the URL and then the name of it? This is the type of thing you don't want to make your user think about. It's kind of like the symlink commands. I like always have to look it up, or like I YOLO it and then I run it and then I get it wrong and I delete it and do it again. If you don't have this problem, I have this problem. This is where I like to introduce flags. The URL turning into a flag means the order doesn't matter. I can do whatever I want. And all of a sudden, my CLI's pattern is guessable. The positional argument I like to go with, it's always the name. Anything else that isn't the name, it's a flag. And all of a sudden, the user can move on with their lives and not have to read my help text. Otherwise, though, when the positional arguments aren't different types, so in here, when I'm deleting something, I'm deleting multiple repositories here, func and borfunc. I'm super creative. It doesn't matter which order I delete them in. I could have done delete, morfunc, and func. It totally would have worked either way. In that case, it was perfectly fine to have multiple positional arguments, so this is legit according to my grammar. So we've got some natural sounding and looking commands. That's the human side of it, the person at the terminal. Now let's look at, if we want to automate it, what should this look like? And I'm not totally creative, so I fall back to JSON. And what I like to do is for every single command that my CLI supports, I like to have an output flag. And actually, usually give them JSON and YAML or whatever. I don't know why someone used YAML, but just in case. Probably for Kubernetes. Every single command, though, I'd like to give them the option of being able to not have to use sed or awk and doing weird piping and scraping human formatted output. Even something like Emote version, I don't want them parsing through that to find the actual version piece. I'd like for them to be able to get JSON formatted output, for example, and be able to target just the SHA or just the semver. Now, once you have the option, though, of getting JSON or getting a table or getting YAML, think of the poor person typing. Think of the poor person typing. Always do human output first, okay? The shortest thing they type should be human output. Corollary, I can't read ISO formatted date times. This is not a skill I have. So when I see something like this, it's like, I mean, this is what is going to get printed out if I just like dump something like some ghost structs. I can see 2019 and I kind of see July and then, okay. There's this really awesome library called Go Humanize and I love using it. It has support for dates, but it can do all sorts of things. It can do, you know, like sizes for like megabytes and gigabytes and adding S's on the end of words when you're pluralizing, all sorts of stuff. I totally recommend you use it because this acknowledges that there's a person on the other side of this terminal, which is great. Another trick I like to do when I'm working with like, how can I make things a little easier for the person typing and give them a little bit less to type, is your binary name itself. Sometimes it's a verb or a resource all on its own. Emote, emoticon. I can get away with just saying emote list, and you probably know what I meant, right? Like emote list kind of looks like emoticons, list emoticons. So I can get away with something much shorter. And this is an alias that I like to provide to my users. And you can actually come up with a whole bunch of aliases this way. And what they're usually related to is the domain that I'm working with. Emoticons is the domain, and I may end up with like 6 or 7 aliases in this case where I've made life easier for people. Once you start doing that, though, you're going to want to give people a little bit of help. And this is what I like to do is customize my help text. So all the frameworks out there will generate help text for you, but what they're going to do is just focus on what commands are out there and what flags are there, which is actually like the least useful information that there is. I mean, you can get at that and like you put it on your website or whatever, but what I really want to help people with and make them be successful with my command line tool is how would I use it? How are you going to be successful? What should you really be doing with these commands? Why would you run the command? What should you be passing in as an argument instead of giving like, this is the name, this is description, this is the title, this is a file. These are not helpful help text values. Give them a little bit more. Go through the trouble of customizing this. So for Emote here, what I could do is, because I introduced kind of a unique thing that most things CLI tools don't support, is a concept of aliases. I've customized my help text and added in the concept of a grouping where I can say, here are my resources, as in here are things you can work with, emoticons and repos, and then here are alias commands, as here's the shortcuts, here's the things you can do really fast once you're like a super ninja with Emote. Now, none of this is actually super useful. Like if I made a CLI and I stopped here, there was no point. The real reason why anyone uses the Emote CLI is to print silly things to Slack. So what I really wanted was Emote Shrug or Emote table flip. And these are things that are task-based commands. But I kind of broke a rule when I did that. All of a sudden, Shrug, it isn't really a noun, it isn't really a verb. I used the name of a resource instead. And that's okay. You're totally allowed to cheat. You should always balance between when I should follow my grammatical rules and when I should do things that make sense for the domain I'm working in. One thing that I think is the most important thing about your command line tool, though, is you should combine your commands into tasks. So I want to look at not Emote for a second. I want to look at a CLI that maybe people are a little more familiar with, the Travis CI system. So they have this concept of, during my builds, I want to shove a secret in there, like secret to AWS or something like that, so I can connect and do cool things. And so the encrypt command actually does 3 things for me. It grabs my public key from the repository. It does super complicated, weird stuff with OpenSSL that I don't understand. And then it inserts that encrypted value into my Travis configuration file for me. And it does it all with a tidy single command. And this is why I kind of like working with the Travis CLI. It would probably fall in as a CLI that I love. But let's say that they hadn't done that. What would be the hot mess that you'd be stuck with that maybe you wouldn't love? Oh, no problem. You just call PubKey, and then you echo out super secret, and then you copy and paste an OpenSSL command that you don't understand from Stack Overflow, no problem. And then you pipe that into env add. Yeah, where are you going? Why don't you like my tool anymore? And here's the problem. This is perfectly fine for automation. I mean, you'll get away with it. People will like figure it out once, copy and paste it, put it in a file, and forget about it. But no one wants to run this and type it in, and they will not thank you. Whenever it's a person typing a command, give them one command that they can actually say out loud and understand. All right, so we're trying to make a CLI that people love, right? How are we doing? So I think we've got some commands that make sense. We've solved an important task, which is saying silly things to our coworkers on Slack. But I said high quality was pretty important to me. And I don't know, we haven't really touched on code, and this is GopherCon, so they're going to kick me off stage. We should talk about code. So this is 1 second, like I'm going to hop on my soapbox here and say why it's important that a CLI should have high quality code. Not just because it's like my job and all I do is write CLIs all day. Like, we need a better answer than that. Think about the backend service that you just wrote and how people access it. We've probably got either a website in front of it or we have a CLI in front of it. And if it's no good, they're not going to bother and they're not going to use it. So it needs to be a great user experience and it needs to be robust. It needs to stand up to whatever it is they're doing. It needs to spew back good, sensible error messages, and it needs to work. So it needs to be just as high quality as whatever your backend is. It needs to be just as well respected. It needs to be maintainable, which means it needs to be testable. How many people actually understand how to properly test code that's embedded in Cobra? I don't see a lot of hands. It's really hard. So let's look at how we would actually properly write a command line tool that uses Cobra and all the wonderful Steve Francia libraries and really test it, and those tests don't suck. We're going to focus on the one task-based command inside of Emote that's fun and cool. We're going to make something that prints out emoticons like Shrug and table flip, stuff like that. So like I said, we're going to use all the SPF 13 libraries because 1, they're the ones that are most commonly used by everyone, and 2, I've used a whole bunch, and they're seriously the most solid ones, so yeah. So Cobra is going to give you everything that you need out of the box in order to work with a command line tool. So it's going to give you error handling. It's going to give you basically the connection between I typed in this command, this is the function to run. It's going to give you that auto-generated help text, which you should immediately customize. And it's going to give you flag parsing that's way smarter than what comes with just like the flag standard library. So this is what it looks like when you use Cobra and you build out just like the main wiring around that emote command. It doesn't have Shrug implemented. It's just enough to give you a main and it would handle your errors and then handle typing in emote, okay? So if you look down here at the bottom here and build emote command, it's going to run a Cobra command. It's going to build a Cobra command, and where it says use, it's going to handle the word, the command, emote. So let's take a look at what Shrug is going to look like so we can type emote Shrug. A little bit bigger, but this is all the code, okay? So it's not too bad. We're not too scared. So again, we're going to have another Cobra command, and for another use here, it's going to handle Shrug, all right? And then we're going to skip down. We're going to scan to the bottom real quick, because that's how Cobra kind of works. We just mentally skip over run for a second. We're going to define some flags that we'd like to work with, and we're going to define a destination flag, because we'd like to send our emoticon somewhere, like to Slack, to Twitter, to our clipboard, something like that. So we've defined a flag called dest for destination. By default, we'd like to send it to the clipboard, and we'd like to print out some help text for it. So where do we want to send our emoticon? And now the way Cobra works is it gives you a function handler called run, and I've decided to do an anonymous function handler because 99% of the CLIs that I've seen on the internet do this. So that's what I wanted to show you first. So I have an anonymous function, and it does the hard-coded Shrug for now. And I use a clipboard library that I just found on the internet, so it's probably like totes legit. And it'll either print out to the clipboard or it'll just print standard out. And it works. And this is where most command line tools that I've seen, and to be honest, that I wrote myself in the past, have stopped. Because it works. So we're done. No. Okay. So this is where we don't want to stop here. And there's a couple problems. So one, who noticed that the package is main? That means no one can reuse my code. No one can build on Emote and make like beautiful emote ponies and like better things. That's sad. We have another problem, which is func. Run is this anonymous function, which means it's going to be hard to test, and it's embedded inside a Cobra, which makes it like triple dog dare hard to test, because you got to understand how Cobra works. Nothing's awful about Cobra, but you've now invested into like understanding for every single person on the team, if they want to work on the tests for this, they need to understand what's the order that these function handlers are called, and how does it work, and how do I sub things out, and how do I inject like buffers and all sorts of stuff like that. And then we have one more super glaring problem with the code I wrote. Microsoft is totally going to fire me. The command shrug is hard-coded. Every single time I want to have a new emoticon, I've got to add a new Cobra command. This is not going to stand. We need to fix this. If you do one thing after this talk, please do this one thing. Make a package outside of main and write a struct inside of it, and for every single command that you support, add a function. Okay? So like I had a command called shrug, add a function for shrug. And so that someone could essentially automate and replicate what your CLI does without ever touching Cobra. It takes the CLI out of your CLI, and it makes it so much easier to work with. So what does this look like? I made a new package, called it emoticons, and I made the most boring app struct ever. It's completely empty. It's just a place for me to put all my commands, okay? And I've defined shrug on it. And all I did was took that run handler, copy and pasted the code, and put it here on app, okay? And so now my Cobra wiring looks a lot easier to understand. It's a lot more boring. And boring wiring is what we want, because boring wiring doesn't need extensive testing. I make a new instance of my app, I call shrug, and I pass in my one flag. What's really cool about this now is when I want to test my CLI, when I want to test the logic, now I can just write my tests against app, and I can ignore all this Cobra stuff. And I'm going to show you what that looks like just a little farther on. But this, we're already starting to move towards testable code that we can trick somebody else on the team to working on, which is cool. Oops. So let's tackle the next problem, though, which is shrug was still hard-coded. It's still a hard-coded function on app, which is no good. So I'd like to add a TOML file, because why not? So I'm going to add a TOML file that has a list of all the emoticons that I would like my CLI to understand. And then what's cool about this is I can add new ones on the fly. So I'm going to put in shrug, because I like that one, and I'm also a huge fan of table flip, because I'm a very emotionally smooth sailing person. Okay. But this is open source. Oh no, what's happening? People are ruining my wonderful CLI. Immediately, as soon as you add a configuration file, people are going to want all the markup languages. This is not a bad thing. This brings me to my next point. People are going to want things, and your first gut instinct is going to be YAML sucks. Why do you want JSON? It's hard to read. Guys, don't you realize TOML is an improvement? And Deb picked TOML, so yeah. No. I strongly believe that this is an opportunity. People are giving you this wonderful indicator of what is going to make them like your command line tool. And if you give them that, if you meet them where they are, they're going to be happier for it, and they're going to just think that your tool is amazing. If you don't meet them, all of a sudden they're going to have to do silly, awful hacks and the dreaded piping, or using conversion tools, or just not using it at all because you left them hanging. So we don't want to do that. So this is the answer. Not ponies, but support all of them. And the way we're going to support all of them is, ta-da, more SPF 13 libraries, obviously. And now Viper has like all that in a bag of chips, but the important thing that it supports, because it's like the first thing that forces me to add Viper into any command line tool, is that it supports multiple configuration formats in a really smart, intelligent way with like, I don't know, 5 lines of code. We'll see in just a second. So we're gonna modify app here. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna introduce Viper. So we're gonna import Viper, and we're gonna add it in to our app. And I'm gonna add a new function here, and Dave Cheney will slap me upside the head. But that's okay, he's not up on stage, I am. So I'm gonna add new here. And what Viper will do is that when I call readin config, it's gonna look in the path that I gave it, and I gave it dot, so that's the current directory, and it's gonna look for config files. And it's gonna look for config.toml, oh, didn't find it, config.yaml, oh, didn't find it, config.json, oh, okay, I found config.json, cool. I'm gonna read that in. It's gonna look for all sorts of ones, and it's gonna use the appropriate encoder and read it in, and it's gonna save it into that Viper field that I have on app. And it's gonna load it up and just be ready for me later. The next change that I did is I don't have a Shrug function anymore. Remember I used to have a hard-coded Shrug? Now I have a generic function called Emote, because this is where we wanted to go. So Emote, what it does, it still ... prints out emoticons. But first what it does is it looks up in that save configuration that Viper loaded up, and it checks that emoticon list, that dynamic list that I had in my config file. And it looks for an emoticon named after whatever name I pass it in. And it goes, okay, I've looked up emoticon.shrug or emoticon.tableflip, and it finds the representation with that fun ASCII string blob. And that's what it prints out. So this is kind of a big change to our app. So what does that make our command, our Cobra wiring look like? Kind of a big change, but it's a good change. Our Cobra wiring just got a lot smaller. We don't have build shrug anymore, because we don't need a hard-coded shrug command. We're down to just one Cobra command now, just build emote. And so what it does is I'm reading my code and I'm totally lost. Sorry, no. What it does is instead of having the hard-coded shrug, instead of being a command, is now a positional argument. And so it reads that in off of the args, and it passes it in to Emote. One other trick I did is I took advantage of a nice little function off of Cobra that says I need exactly one arg. So you notice I didn't do any validation. I'm totally cheating, and I'm letting Cobra take advantage of this for me. And so Cobra will kick back errors if I just call Emote and I don't like pass in Shrug or anything like that. So if you're wondering where all the cheating's coming from, it's args. Exact args one there. So things got a lot easier. And now as I add new commands, say I add monocle or something like that, just approving Shrug, who knows, somersault. I don't need to add more Cobra commands. So this is really cool, but I did one thing that definitely will come back and bite you in the butt, which is you noticed in my application, I'm directly reading into Viper's configuration. And that's totally fine, but it has a couple different drawbacks that will be frustrating later on. One is that anyone who's working on your application now needs to understand Viper. I'm doing pretty simple stuff here, so it doesn't seem that scary. But when I start reading things from environment variables, overriding configuration with flag variables, things like that, it gets a little trickier. People who start working on it are gonna go, I don't know Viper, I don't have to touch that code. I'm going back to the back end, see you later. It's just like I isolated Cobra, I'd like to isolate Viper too, and remove that excuse from all the people who don't want to work on my CLI. So what I do is I usually make a configuration package, and I shove all the Viper stuff there. The other nice side effect of that is that the configuration is loaded once, and then it's put inside of a struct, and then it's not constantly reread and evaluated over and over and over again. So I made a struct called config, and I have my emoticon map there of what's the name and then what's the representation. And then I made a load struct that basically just did what new was doing before. It figured out what configuration file I'm using, it read it in, and instead of just saving it inside of Viper to continually be like reevaluated, it unmarshals it into the struct, and it's done. Viper's out of the equation at that point. So now my application will take in a config, load it up, and then just save that struct and work with it. And this is kind of nice, because now in my app code, I'm just working with that struct, and it feels very normal and natural as Go feels, and it's kind of nice. So I've kind of just talked about one thing about Viper, where Viper does a lot of really cool stuff, and once you start dealing with more interesting config problems, don't try to solve it yourself. Go back to Viper and like dig up the next feature, because there's like 30 features in there. One feature that I really like about it is that usually I have a flag, like destination. And I also had a configuration value in my config file. I had dest again. And what I really want is that when I don't specify the flag, I want it to come from that config file. And bind pflags, wonderful name, is the magic. So I added dest to my configuration struct here, and I call the magic thing that I found in a GitHub issue on Viper's GitHub, and that's what makes that work. So this is the final wiring for my emote command. And I've introduced one more Cobra handler that is pretty much critical, and it's PreRunE. And this is where I like to stick all of my one-time loading, validation, configuration, all this stuff. And this gets run after all my flags have been evaluated, but before run is called. So this is a good time to swap out output buffers, load up config, validate flags that have been passed to you, all sorts of stuff. Shove all that stuff there. Not inside the handler, please. Call it out from somewhere else that you define in a separate package. So this is where I'm loading my config once and getting that into the app, and then I can call run. And the other thing I did was I very sneakily got rid of that single dest variable that I was declaring and started binding my flag directly to the configuration struct, which had dest. So it looks a lot cleaner. There's not a lot of wiring to test here, and you definitely can write tests for it, and if I'm feeling enterprising, I'll like write a blog post about it, but like ain't no way the Cobra wiring tests are gonna fit on a slide or anything like that. And it's a little complicated. But let's look at the tests for what the application tests would look like. So I'd like to test my emote function. So I'm going to make an output buffer so I can see whatever is being printed to standard out. And I kind of cheated. I didn't show that, but I added a little output buffer to my application. So I'm going to new up my application, and I'm going to give it my output buffer. And then this is kind of nice. Because I got rid of Viper, instead of having to figure out how to mock up Viper and test it, I just made a new config object and assigned it to my app. And I gave it some dummy emoticons. I'm lazy, so I just put Shrug in there. And so now I can call emote Shrug, right? And then I can assert that that's what got printed out, was Shrug. And this is just normal Go code. This is entirely testable, and no one has any excuse then to not work on my CLI. And that makes me terribly happy. So I think we did it, right? Like, now if you don't have a brand new CLI to work on, like, don't be sad, okay? Like, you may not have a chance to rewrite all your commands. Please don't, actually. Make your users very sad. If you do have a new command line tool, like, go for it. This is going to be really fun. But if you say you have an existing command line tool, all the refactoring things that you saw me do, taking code out of Cobra, introducing fiber, maybe supporting additional configuration, adding those tests, those are all things you can quietly do that won't interrupt and make your users sad. It'll make your code a lot more robust, and it'll remove anyone's excuse from like working on your code. And maybe I hammered that a lot. Like maybe you have like wonderful teams where like everyone is like totally like, yeah, I work on the back end and the front end and the side end or whatever end. You know, I sometimes suffer from being the only person who's willing to work on the CLI, so I've got an axe to grind. But these are things that you can do like tomorrow, and you can write one test and then like stop for a week, and you've totally made things better. And you can just like every Friday add one test, do one extraction, do one refactor, and it's gonna be worthwhile. So give it a try, and like DM me on Slack or like on Twitter and let me know how it goes. I think it'd be really fun. Thank you.